They came treated like royalty, but acted like gods. They turned up their noses at the very sustenance of the land that welcomed them. The Italian National Volleyball team thought they were untouchable, pristine giants visiting a lesser world. But in the sweltering, unforgiving heat of Manila, they learned a brutal lesson. Arrogance is the quickest path to dehydration. The only thing they ended up swallowing was a bitter, humiliating 3-0 defeat that no amount of expensive, imported bottled water could wash away. This is a true story of how a simple glass of water sparked a revolution on the court and proved that you never disrespect Filipino hospitality. The arrival of the Italian team at Ninoy Aquino International Airport was a spectacle of high-fashion sportswear and designer luggage. They stepped off the plane looking like marble statues brought to life, pristine and untouchable by the tropical humidity that immediately enveloped them. A delegation of Filipino hosts waited with traditional Sampaguita garlands and warm, genuine smiles, ready to offer the world-renowned Filipino hospitality. However, the atmosphere soured almost instantly when the Italian team captain, Alessandro Russo, tall and imposingly built, breezed past the welcoming committee. He barely acknowledged the garlands offered to him, adjusting his expensive sunglasses and marching straight toward the air-conditioned team bus, leaving the hosts holding the flowers with fading smiles. The incident that would define the entire tournament happened that very evening at the official welcome banquet. It was a lavish affair meant to showcase local cuisine and culture. A Filipino waiter, impeccably dressed, moved around the Italian table, pouring glasses of ice water from a crystal pitcher. As the waiter approached Alessandro Russo, the captain dramatically raised his hand, stopping the pour midstream with a look of theatrical disgust on his face. The entire room seemed to quiet down to watch the exchange. Russo reached down into his designer sports bag and pulled out a plastic bottle of imported European mineral water, slamming it onto the table with a loud thud that echoed through the silent hall. The stage is set for one of the most satisfying slices of karma in sports history. You are about to witness exactly what happens when you disrespect the very soil and water of the nation hosting you. But before we dive into this brutal, sweat-soaked 3-0 sweep, do me a quick favor. If you love incredible stories of underdogs fighting back, unbreakable national pride, and absolute poetic justice, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on the notification bell and drop where you are watching in the comment section. When you do, you will always be the absolute first to see our newest, most interesting stories the very second they drop. Are you ready to see a giant get humbled by the Manila heat? Let's head to the court. The insult was not subtle. It was a public declaration of superiority. Russo loudly proclaimed, in English heavily accented with disdain, that his team could not risk their delicate systems with a local tap water. He gestured dismissively at the pitcher held by the embarrassed waiter, treating the very water of the country hosting him as if it were poison. His teammates snickered, pulling out their own imported bottles, creating a fortress of plastic around their plates. The Filipino staff in the room froze, the sting of the insult cutting deep into their cultural pride. It wasn't just about water. It was a rejection of their home, their cleanliness, and their dignity. News of the water incident spread through the Philippines like wildfire in a dry season. Within hours, a blurry cell phone video of Russo rejecting the water pitcher went viral on social media platforms. The comments section erupted with a mix of disbelief, hurt, and rapidly intensifying anger from the Filipino public. Memes mocking the delicate Italians began circulating, contrasting their arrogance with the everyday resilience of Filipinos who thrived on that very same water. The narrative shifted instantly from welcoming excited guests to hosting arrogant invaders who needed to be taught a lesson in respect. In the Filipino team's training camp, the mood shifted from nervous excitement to a cold, hard resolve. The team captain, a scrappy and intense player named Marco Cruz, stood in the center of the locker room, holding up his phone with a viral video playing on loop. He didn't need to give a rousing speech. The silent fury in the room was palpable. Every player felt the insult personally, a slap in the face to their mothers who cooked with that water, and their fathers who drank it after a hard day's work. Cruz simply pointed to the screen, then pointed to his chest, right over the Philippine flag on his jersey, his eyes burning with a desire for retribution. The Italian team, oblivious to the storm brewing outside their hotel walls, doubled down on their arrogance during the pre-match press conference the next day. When a brave local journalist asked Alessandro Russo about the water incident, Russo leaned back in his chair, smirking dismissively. He gave a careless shrug, stating that elite athletes require elite fuel, insinuating again that everything in the Philippines was substandard for their needs. He even made a joke about not wanting to catch anything before the finals, a comment that drew polite laughter from the international press but ice-cold stare from the local media present. Game day arrived, bringing with it the legendary Manila heat, a suffocating blanket of humidity that hovered around 38 degrees Celsius even inside the arena. The atmosphere outside the stadium was electric and hostile. Thousands of fans lined up, many carrying large, symbolic jugs of local water, chanting nationalistic songs. Inside, the air conditioning was struggling to keep up with the massive, energetic crowd packed into every seat. The humidity hung in the air like a physical weight, slicking the skin of everyone present within minutes of entering the building. When the Italian team jogged onto the court for warm-ups, they were met with a wall of noise that was far from welcoming. It was a deep, guttural roar of disapproval, mixed with ironic chants of water from the stands. The Italians, still looking pristine in their tight, professional uniforms, seemed taken aback by the ferocity of the crowd. They tried to maintain their cool, aloof facade, casting dismissive glances at the stands, but the sheer volume of the animosity was impossible to ignore completely. In stark contrast, when the Filipino team entered, the arena erupted in a unified explosion of support that shook the floorboards. Marco Cruz led his team out, their faces set in grim determination, refusing to smile or acknowledge the cheers. They were not there to be celebrated heroes yet. They were there on a mission of vengeance. They looked towards the Italian side of the court not as opponents in a game, but as symbols of disrespect that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. The first set began exactly as the experts had predicted, with Italian technical superiority dominating the play. Russo, towering over the smaller Filipino blockers, hammered spikes that bounced off the floor with terrifying velocity. The Italians moved with clockwork precision, their imported fuel seemingly working wonders as they jumped higher and hit harder. They celebrated every point with exaggerated gusto, shouting in Italian and glaring down at the Filipino players they had just overpowered. The Filipino team looked overwhelmed in those early minutes, scrambling desperately just to keep the ball in play. Marco Cruz was diving all over the floor, sacrificing his body to dig up the Italian spikes, but the power gap seemed insurmountable. The crowd's noise dipped slightly into worried murmurs as the scoreboard showed a disheartening 10-4 lead for Italy. The Italians on the bench were already laughing, relaxed, and confident that this would be an easy, straight-set victory. Russo continued his assault at the net, enjoying the mismatch against the shorter Filipino defenders. After scoring a particularly vicious kill block that sent Marco Cruz sprawling to the floor, Russo stood over him for a second too long. He dusted off his hands in a gesture that clearly said too easy before turning his back on the fallen Filipino captain. It was another subtle insult, another log thrown onto the fire of Filipino rage burning inside Cruz. The first set ended 25-15 for Italy, a convincing scoreline that reflected their physical dominance. The Italian players sauntered off the court, barely breaking a sweat, grabbing their specific, labeled imported water bottles from their cooler. They looked cool, collected, and completely in control of the narrative. The Filipino players, by contrast, were already drenched in sweat, breathing hard, looking frustrated and outmatched as they huddled around their coach. But as the second set began, a subtle shift started to occur in the environment of the arena. The heat, which the Italians had ignored in the first set, began to seep into their bones. The humidity inside the packed stadium was rising, turning the air thick and heavy, making every breath feel like inhaling soup. The pristine Italian jerseys were starting to show dark patches of sweat, and their movements were losing that crisp, robotic precision they had displayed earlier. The Filipinos, born and raised in the suffocating climate, were used to the air feeling heavy. They noticed the Italians starting to wipe their faces more frequently, their chests heaving a little deeper between points. Marco Cruz saw Russo bend over, hands on his knees, gasping for air after a long rally. A shark-like grin spread across Cruz's face. He realized the giant was beginning to feel the environment fighting back. The tide began to turn visibly around the midway point of the second set. An Italian attacker went up for a routine spike, but, exhausted by the heat, mistimed his jump and slammed the ball directly into the net. The crowd erupted, sensing blood in the water. The Filipinos, energized by the shift, began to play with a frantic, scrappy energy, diving for impossible balls and keeping rallies alive through sheer willpower. Russo, increasingly frustrated by the heat and the sudden resilience of his opponents, began to make uncharacteristic errors. He went up for a massive serve, intended to silence the crowd, but his sweat-slick hand slipped on the ball, sending it sailing wildly out of bounds. The error was met with deafening jeers from the crowd. Russo ripped off his sunglasses, which he had worn even indoors, and threw them toward his bench in a fit of pique, his face shining with exertion. The Filipino Puso, the famous fighting heart, was now on full display. Marco Cruz, feeding off the energy of the crowd and the visible suffering of the Italians, seemed to grow inches taller. He leaped violently at the net, meeting Russo at the apex of his jump. In a moment that would be replayed for years, the smaller Cruz threw up a solid wall of the block, stuffing Russo's spike straight down onto the Italian side of the court. The arena absolutely exploded. The noise was so intense it felt like a physical blow. Cruz landed and let out a primal roar, pounding his chest, staring directly at the stunned Russo. The Italian captain looked completely bewildered, sweat dripping from his nose, his lungs burning from the thick, humid air that his imported water couldn't help him navigate. The psychological armor of the Italians had been cracked. The Philippines took the second set 25-22, a stunning reversal that left the Italian team reeling. During the break, the Italian bench was chaos. The coach was yelling in Italian, frantically fanning his players with a clipboard. The players were slumped over, draping ice towels on their heads, guzzling their imported water, which seemed to be doing nothing to cool their overheated cores. They looked shell-shocked, victims of both the relentless Filipino defense and the unforgiving tropical climate. By the start of the third set, the Italians were broken men. Their physical superiority had evaporated in the heat, leaving them sluggish and mentally fatigued. The Filipinos, meanwhile, were playing on pure adrenaline and righteous anger. They smelled blood and attacked relentlessly, showing no mercy to the opponents who had disrespected their home. The third set was a massacre, a complete dismantling of the Italian team's reputation. The Filipinos were everywhere, digging up every lazy Italian attack and transitioning instantly into lightning-fast counterattacks. The Italians couldn't move their feet. They looked like they were running in quicksand, their energy completely sapped by the Manila heat they had mocked. Russo was a shadow of the arrogant giant who had arrived days earlier. He was subbed out halfway through the third set, completely ineffective and bordering on heat exhaustion. He sat on the bench with a towel over his head, hiding his face in the cameras, the shame radiating off him in waves. The crowd mercilessly chanted, "Local water, local water," every time the camera panned to the fallen captain. Marco Cruz was unstoppable, channeling the collective vengeance of his nation into every swing. He hammered a cross-court spike that landed untouched in the back corner, bringing the score to a humiliating 20-10 for the Philippines. The Italian defenders didn't even move for the ball. They just watched it land, too exhausted and defeated to make an effort. Match point was a moment of pure poetic justice. A weak, tired serve from the Italian substitute was easily received by the Filipinos. The setter lofted a perfect ball for Marco Cruz on the outside. Cruz approached the net, leaping higher than he ever had in his life, and smashed the ball down the line, past the despairing block of the Italians. The ball hit the floor with a thud that was immediately drowned out by the pandemonium in the arena. The scoreboard flashed the final score of the set, 25-12, a 3-0 sweep. The impossible victory was complete. The Filipino players collapsed into a heap in the center of the court, crying tears of joy and exhaustion, embracing each other in the realization of what they had just achieved. The Italian team stood frozen on their side of the net, staring blankly at the celebrating Filipinos. They were utterly humiliated, stripped of their arrogance and defeated not just by a better team on the day, but by the very environment they had turned their noses up at. The heat had humbled them, and the Filipino spirit had broken them. As a customary post-game handshake took place at the net, the atmosphere changed from raucous celebration to a tense hush. Marco Cruz led his team down the line, shaking the hands of the defeated Italians. When Cruz reached Alessandro Russo, the Italian captain couldn't even look him in the eye, mumbling a faint congratulations while looking at his feet. Then, in a gesture that defined the true character of the Filipino people, Marco Cruz stepped back. He motioned to a team attendant, who brought over a simple, condensation-covered glass pitcher of local Manila tap water and a clean glass. The arena went completely silent, watching the interaction. Cruz poured a glass of the cold water and held it out to the exhausted, dehydrated Italian captain. It was the ultimate test of character. Russo hesitated, looking at the glass, then at Cruz's stoic face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a painful realization of his folly. Slowly, humbly, with shaking hands, Russo took the glass. He raised it in a slight, apologetic nod to Cruz and drained it in one gulp. The crowd, seeing this act of humility and the Filipino forgiving grace, erupted in one final, respectful cheer. The Italians had lost the game, but in that final sip of local water, they had finally learned their lesson in respect.